Today we are discussing the Apocalypse of Adam, which is a banned book from the Bible that tells the story of Adam and Eve from Adam's point of view, and it is much different indeed, as it reveals completely contrary to what the Bible says, that God is actually the devil and has trapped humanity on earth to enslave them. It's an excellent read, to say the least. And I have been getting so many people asking me to read this because I actually did a short introduction video on this, which you can find in the description of this video. It's about 15 minutes, and it gives you a quick intro to what the Apocalypse of Adam actually is. But I got so many requests from people saying, can you actually read from the text itself? So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be reading from the Apocalypse of Adam, examining it, seeing exactly what it says. And for those who don't know, this was part of the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library. So this book was discovered around 1946 in a graveyard near the tombs of Egypt. And an apocalypse is basically a revelation of great information. That's what an apocalypse is. So the Apocalypse of Adam is a revelation of important, hidden, secret information to his son Seth. And this is going to be revealing what Adam thinks of God. And as you'll see, it's completely different from what you read in the Bible. Now, once again, this is a text from Sethian Gnosticism, and a lot of people think that this is an early text because there's a lot of important ideas, but they aren't as developed as other Sethian Gnostic texts are. I'll get into more detail about that and explain exactly what I mean as we go on. But if you haven't seen my videos on the Secret Gospel of John, I highly recommend going and watching the Secret Gospel of John, the video series I did on that, because that'll give you great context for what we're about to read. But even if you haven't seen those or haven't seen them yet, don't worry, because I'll be doing recaps and summaries to kind of fill in the gaps and let you know exactly what's going on as we read the Apocalypse of Adam. And once again, this is going to be, the complete antithesis, the complete opposite of how you've been told the story of Adam and Eve and Noah's Ark in, the Bible. I will be making available my notes, my lecture notes for this live stream for those who are supporting on Patreon. So if you want to see my notes, support on Patreon, and you'll be able to have access to those as well. And I'll also have links in the description of this video, for playlists and videos that will be helping to understand this even more. But let's begin the Apocalypse of Adam. Okay, so we're about to get started here. Now, as I said, it's thought that the Apocalypse of Adam is a very early Gnostic text because it follows Gnostic themes, but in a less developed way. For example, Yaldabaoth is often just called God. I mean, later he's briefly referred to as Sakla, but usually he's just called God, and the one true God that we know as us, and usually in Sethian Gnosticism they call the Great Invisible Spirit or the Monad or the Virgin Spirit, is just called God as well. So it's kind of confusing. You have to see the context to which God they're talking about. Eons and Archons aren't really differentiated. They don't, Sophia isn't really in there, though a precursor to Sophia is referenced, which is actually really cool, and we'll be talking about probably in a continued stream, because I don't think we're going to be able to get the entire Apocalypse of Adam in just one stream, but we'll be talking about that. But my point is that the Apocalypse of Adam is an important Sethian Gnostic book. However, it's most likely one of the earliest, so there is a lot of context that is necessary to make it make sense. So basically what we are going to be doing is reading the Apocalypse of Adam, but also using the Secret Book of John, another Sethian Gnostic text, to give it some context, fill in the gaps, and show what it's really getting at. If you haven't seen my videos on the Secret Gospel of John, don't worry, I'll be summarizing everything and giving you what you need to know. However, I highly recommend you watch them because you'll be able to get even more out of this. So let's just start it up, and I will explain as we go. So this is the apocalypse of Adam, which is Adam revealing, that's what an apocalypse is, a revelation of great information, revealing to his son Seth his side of the story, everything that's gone on with the God of the Bible and the creation of humanity and the Garden of Eden, Noah's Ark, all these things. Adam is telling his son, and we'll see that, some of it involves prophecy, because obviously Noah's Ark and the flood hasn't happened yet. But this is sort of the context that we're jumping into. So it says here, by the way, you can read all these for free on gnosis.org. The revelation which Adam taught his son Seth in the 700th year, saying, "Listen to my words, my son Seth. When God had created me out of the earth, along with Eve, your mother, I went about with her in a glory which she had seen in the eon from which we had come forth. She taught me a word of knowledge of the eternal God." Now, when it says a word of knowledge of the eternal God, we are now talking about not the God of the Bible, but the true God. And so in Gnosticism, the God of the Bible is an evil creator God, a lesser God. The true God is a pure mind. And everything is a fragment or a piece of this eternal mind. So the God of the Bible in Gnosticism is referred to as Yaldabaoth or Sakla or Saklas. And I'll be referring it often to Yaldabaoth, even though in the Apocalypse of Adam, they don't call him Yaldabaoth. They just call him God, or very briefly Sakla. But I'll be referring to him as Yaldabaoth, so it's easy to tell the difference which God we're talking about. The evil creator God of the Bible, Yaldabaoth, or the one eternal God, which we all are, and everything is derived from. So we, as in Adam and Eve, resembled the great eternal angels, for we were higher than the God who had created us and the powers with him, whom we did not know. Then God, the ruler of the eons and the powers, divided us in wrath. Then we became 2 eons. And the glory in our hearts left us and your mother Eve, along with the first knowledge that breathed within us. So what we're going to do here, it's to understand this better, is take a look at what the secret Gospel of John says about this. Because Adam is now talking about that originally, okay, so what Adam has just told his son is that originally Adam and Eve were one being, an extremely powerful being that resembled the great eternal angels and were higher than the God of the Bible. And the God of the Bible did not like this. He did not want to be more powerful than, we didn't want this being to be more powerful than him. And so to stop this from happening, he split them in 2. Into Adam and Eve, which were originally one. Now let's understand this better in context derived from the secret Gospel of John. So first a lot of people ask, well, if God created the human, how is if the God of the Bible, Yaldabaoth, created the human, how is the human more powerful than the God of the Bible? A lot of people have been making these comments and asking these questions. So let me explain to this in a very quick way. If you want a better explanation, watch my whole streams on the secret Gospel of John. But here it is in a nutshell. You have the one true God, which is the eternal mind, the monad. This is not the God of the Bible. You have the one eternal mind. And within this one eternal mind are divine patterns. And there is a divine pattern of the human. Think of this like a divine blueprint. So you have this divine, perfect blueprint of the human, this powerful entity. Now, Yaldabaoth is not, and Yaldabaoth is the god of the Bible, is not a perfect pattern. Yaldabaoth is a fractured, asymmetric, imperfect pattern. Yaldabaoth was born from asymmetry and an imperfection. That is how Yaldabaoth came into being. Yaldabaoth is still derived from the one mind, but it is an imperfect thought of the divine mind. Whereas the human currently exists in the divine mind as a perfect blueprint or pattern. For those familiar with Plato's domain of forms, it would be like the Platonic domain of forms. Gnostics were extremely well versed in Platonic philosophy. Most of them, anyway. Now, so what happened here? So you have Yaldabaoth, which is this imperfect thought. Yaldabaoth creates the material world. And then what Yaldabaoth wants to do as well is create humans. So what Yaldabaoth does is Yaldabaoth models the creation of humanity on that divine perfect blueprint. So what Yaldabaoth does is he is going to create human. And when he creates human, he's first creating human not even as a material body, but just as what you might call like the spiritual body. Okay? So Yaldabaoth is creating the spiritual element of human, what you might think of as the spiritual body, and Yaldabaoth is modeling this on a divine perfect pattern. So Yaldabaoth is an imperfect thought, yet he is putting together something based on perfection. So Yaldabaoth puts together this being based on perfection, and then Yaldabaoth breathes its spark of divinity or life into this being. So Yaldabaoth takes a portion of its power and powers up this divine entity. Now, this is why the human in its spiritual form is more powerful than Yaldabaoth, because it shares the power of Yaldabaoth, but it is modeled on divine pattern and is not an imperfect thought like Yaldabaoth is. Now, Yaldabaoth didn't know this was going to happen. If you want an analogy, think of sort of like a scientist creating like a robot or something, and then powering up the robot, and the robot is, through the algorithms becomes more powerful than the scientist that created it. Kind of like that. That's definitely not a perfect analogy, but if you're having a hard time with it, that can sort of, be a good way to wrap your head around it. So basically, Yaldabaoth modeled human on these divine patterns, and because of this, the human was more powerful than Yaldabaoth. Now, Yaldabaoth did not like this at all. And so what you have here then is it becomes this battle between Yaldabaoth and the human, where Yaldabaoth is constantly trying to divide the human, break up the human, fragment the human, and get the human to forget what it is. And then the human is constantly trying to battle this by engaging in different ways of remembering what it is. And you can already start to see the analogy here that we can take from this, in that we are all divine, but we have been thrown into this world of forgetfulness where we don't remember our divinity, and people look to other things like a fake god in the sky to worship, and they give away their divinity and power. But anyway, so Yaldabaoth is trying all these different ways to ensnare and entrap the human so that it doesn't remember what it is and attain its true power and become more powerful than Yaldabaoth, because Yaldabaoth wants to use humans to be its slaves. And so what happens is that Yaldabaoth takes the human and then creates a material body for it, and not only creates a material body for it, but throws it into the world of matter, and then divides it in two, all to get it to forget what it is and lose its power. And let's see if we can't just actually take a look at some of this here. Just to kind of, I know some of you have seen this already, but just to give a recap. You know, Yaldabaoth's, remember, Yaldabaoth is who the god of the Bible is. Yaldabaoth's demonic forces envied the man. Through their united efforts, he had come into being. They have given their power to him. His understanding was far greater than those who had created him, and greater than that of the chief ruler himself. When they realized that he shone with light and could think better than they could, and was naked of evil, they took him and cast him down into the lowest depths of the material world. It was brought into the shadow of death. They intended to make him anew, this time from earth, water, fire, and wind, which are matter, darkness, desire, the artificial spirit. This all became a tomb, a new kind of body. Those thieves bound the man in it and chained him in forgetfulness, made him subject to dying. So you have all these different ways, this battle between Yaldabaoth and the human, to try and get it to forget what it is. Now, the important thing here is this splitting of the human into, you know, the separateness of Adam and Eve, the one being into two. So in Gnosticism, Eve represents symbolically epinoia. What is epinoia? Epinoia is conceptualization, purposeful thought, insight, intuition. It's what you need for self-reflection. So you have Adam, which is kind of representative of mind and thought, and then you have Eve, which is kind of representative of self-reflective thought in conceptualization, purposeful thinking. And so this is why in the beginning it says, "Listen to my words, my son Seth. When God had created me out of the earth along with Eve, your mother, I went about with her in a glory which she had not seen in the eon from which she had come forth. She taught me a word of knowledge of the eternal God." You see how Eve, which represents self-reflective thought, purposeful thought, conceptualization, is teaching Adam. This is a metaphor, because remember, they were one being. So you have mind that is using its power of self-reflection and conceptualization to understand divinity. But Yaldabaoth doesn't want that. So what Yaldabaoth does is severs, fragments, and divides Adam and Eve into two. So instead of having mind and self-reflective thought and conceptualization in one, this is a metaphor for it being put into two beings. And this is actually a really cool metaphor, because you have Adam, and then you have Eve, and Eve represents conceptualization and purposeful thought, and you need all these things for self-reflection, and you need self-reflection to realize your own divinity. And this is a really cool metaphor, because think about it. When, you know, in this metaphorical terms, when Adam and Eve were one, you had this one being that engaged in self-reflective conceptualization to understand its own divinity. Now, when you split it in two, it's really cool because you now have self-reflection, but metaphorically represented in two beings. And this is hard for me to get across into words, but I think you guys can get what I'm saying. It's cool because self-reflection no longer exists in one being, but it's two beings standing in front of each other. Do you see how cool that is? It's like a mirror, because self-reflection is like looking at oneself, but in one being. But now it's been divided in two, so it is literally looking at oneself, but not recognizing that it's actually looking at oneself, because thought has been othered. This is very Hegelian. In Hegelian philosophy, you have the mind of God that others itself into the material world and then inserts itself into the material world. And since it is the material world, it's seeing itself in that it is engaging in self-reflection constantly because everything is itself, but it doesn't realize that it is self-reflecting. It thinks that everything is apart from itself, and that is the goal of this dialectically evolving universe, is for subject to realize that it is object. This is the unification of subject and object. In esoteric terms, this is called the great work, the unification of subject and object. This is talked about a lot in Hegelianism, not in terms of the great work. It's used, it's said in other terms, but you can see this really cool sort of idea emerging in the apocalypse of Adam in a really, kind of mythological and rudimentary way, though, where you have one being that contains self-reflective thought, but then it was othered into two beings and is literally now looking at itself but not recognizing that it is itself. So, but anyway, you have this battle between Yaldabaoth and humanity where, again, Yaldabaoth, the god of the Bible, is constantly trying to get humanity to forget what it is. Okay, so the god, Yaldabaoth, the ruler of the eons and the powers, divided us in wrath. Then we became two. And the glory in our hearts left us, me and your mother Eve, along with the first knowledge that breathed within us. So do you see how knowledge is leaving them because this self-reflective being has been split into two? It no longer recognizes itself as itself. It has been othered. And glory, fled from us. Glory being this divine knowledge of what one is. It entered into from which it had come forth. Not from this eon from which we had come forth, I and Eve, your mother. But knowledge, entered into the seed of the great eons. For this reason, I myself have called you by the name of the man who is the seed of the great generations from which it comes. Now remember, Adam is talking to Seth, and this is going to be extremely important. Seth is extremely important in Sethian Gnosticism. Seth is so important that scholars call this version of Gnosticism Sethianism, because Seth is sort of the beating heart and the core of what Gnosticism is. And I'll show you why in a moment. After those days, the eternal knowledge of the God of truth. So the God of truth is not Yaldabaoth. The God of truth is the great invisible spirit, the monad, the one mind, which we are all shards and pieces of. For we were not, after those days, the eternal knowledge of the God of truth, the the eternal mind, withdrew from me and your mother Eve. Since that time, we learned about dead things like men. So they are now just, they have no knowledge of their divinity. They're just focusing on dead things, as in the material world, what's around them. Then we recognized the God who had created us. Now they're talking about Yaldabaoth. For we were not strangers to his power. And we served him in fear and slavery. And after these things we became darkened in our hearts. Now I slept in the thought of my heart. So you have this idea of they've been split. Because they have split, they have forgot what they are. They're focused on the material world. They see the power of Yaldabaoth, and they serve him in fear and in slavery. This is exactly what Yaldabaoth wants. He wants them to remain fractured. He wants them to have drunk from forgetfulness. He wants them to be focused on the material world, and he wants them to not remember their own divinity and what they are. Now, one thing that I want to interject here, because I think it'll make this even more clear, is about the tree of life and the tree of knowledge that is described in the secret book of John. So you have Adam and Eve that have been split, and they are thrown into the Garden of Eden. Okay? So in the Garden of Eden, there is the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. And if you read the Bible, it says that God told Adam and Eve that they could eat from any tree they wanted, which would include the tree of life. But they were not to eat from the tree of knowledge, or the tree of knowledge and good and evil. And so in Gnosticism, remember, everything is different. They're basically saying that everything that ends up being included in the Bible, what will become canonical Christianity, that is wrong. That is propaganda from Yaldabaoth, essentially. So how the Gnostics say is that this is a further trap, the tree of life versus the tree of knowledge and good and evil. So I know that some of you have heard me read this before, but I want to read it again because I just really love it so much. So the rulers took the man and put him into paradise. They told him to eat freely, but their food is bitter, their beauty is corrupt, their food is deceit, their trees are ungodliness, their fruit is poison, and their promise is death. They placed the tree of their life into the middle of paradise. I will teach you the secret of their life, the plan that they made together about an artificial spirit. Now, this is important. Remember that term, artificial spirit. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But first, they're talking about the tree of life, or the tree of their life. Its root is bitter, its branches are dead, its shadow is hatred, its leaves are deception, the nectar of wickedness is in its blossoms, its fruit is death, its seed is desire, it flowers in the darkness. Those who eat from it are denizens of Hades. Darkness is their resting place. As for the tree called the knowledge of good and evil, it is the epinoia of the light. They command him not to eat from it, standing in front to conceal it for fear that he might look upwards to the fullness and know the nakedness of his indecency. Okay, so to explain what this means here, and so this is important. Some of you probably have heard me talk about this already, but for those who are new, so you have in the Garden of Eden the two trees, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. The tree of life is not forbidden. They may eat from it, but the tree of knowledge is forbidden. The tree of life actually injects them with the artificial spirit. What the artificial spirit does is it's making them more and more animalistic. It's everything associated with the Freudian id, or the reptilian brain, the brain stem. You have things like instinct, desire, the three F's: fighting, fucking, and fleeing. All this, animalistic, everything that you would really associate with instincts, the body, food, sex. Not that there's anything wrong with this, but that is what the tree of life is. It's injecting them with the artificial spirit, emphasizing these animalistic and primal urges. And again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with these, but this is what the Gnostic myth describes. And then you have the tree of life, which represents epinoia. Eve also represents epinoia, which again represents self-reflective thought, conceptualization, intuition, insight. Now that's associated with the neocortex, associated with intuition, associated with reason, higher modes of thinking. You see, this is completely different. It's associated with mind, higher modes of mind. And that is the true God, which we all are, divine thinking beings, pure thought. And so what Yaldabaoth is doing by injecting them constantly with the artificial spirit, instinct, and primal urges, and making off-limits thought, purposeful thinking, is this continual emphasis on making humans more animalistic and more primal, and less about thought and thinking and self-reflection and conceptualization, because Yaldabaoth does not want them to remember their divinity and become more powerful than it. It wants them to remain its slave. So we have Adam talking to his son. Adam is telling his son how important that he is and how they had forgotten what they were, how Adam and Eve had forgotten what they were. And so Adam is continuing, and I saw 3 men before me whose likeness I was unable to recognize, since they were not the powers of the God who had created us. Meaning they weren't from Yaldabaoth. These were from the one true God, the divine mind, which we all are. And they said to me, "Arise, Adam, from the sleep of death, and hear about the eon and the seed of that man to whom life has come, who came from you and from Eve, your wife." So you have these beings from the divine mind communicating with Adam. But remember, the divine mind is just, higher thinking. So really, these are elements of Adam himself, but Adam doesn't recognize that because Adam is still, immersed in forgetfulness. When I heard these words from the great men who were standing before me, we sighed, I and Eve in our hearts, and the Lord God who had created us stood before us. So now you have Yaldabaoth coming before him, the evil creator God. It says, "Adam, why were you both sighing in your hearts? Do you not know that I am the God who had created you, and I breathed into you a spirit of life as a living soul? Then darkness came upon our eyes." So you have this constant battle, right? You see this constant battle of like Adam and Eve starting to wake up, and then you have this evil creator God keeping them in fear and forgetfulness and slavery. Then the God who created us, Yaldabaoth, created a son from himself and Eve, your mother. And this is elaborated on in the Secret Gospel of John, where it showed that Yaldabaoth actually rapes Eve. And this is the creation of Cain and Abel. So in the Bible, 3 sons are explicitly mentioned: Cain, Abel, and Seth. In Sethian Gnosticism, Cain and Abel are birthed from the rape of Eve. So Cain and Abel aren't the true sons of Adam and Eve. And this is important, all right? This is important. I'll be explaining why in just a moment. Cain and Abel are instead from Eve and Yaldabaoth, this rape that had occurred. And again, I will be explaining why that's important, but suffice to know for now, Seth is the true son of Adam and Eve. So, I knew sweet desire for your mother. I knew a sweet desire for your mother. Then the vigor of our eternal knowledge was destroyed in us, and weakness pursued us. Therefore the days of our life became few, for I knew that I had come under the authority of death. So we have, and again, in the Secret Gospel of John, more about this is uncovered, and that we realize that it's actually through the rape of Eve that the idea of sex kind of becomes born. And in Sethian Gnosticism, there's this very negative view of physical sex. Now remember, again, in Hyperianism, we don't have this view. Physical sex is consensual physical sex is a great thing. It's a great way to experience modes of existence, to come together, to experience unity. It's a wonderful, perfect thing. So well, I don't want to say perfect, but it's a fantastic thing. And I just want to say that because I don't want people to think. Remember, we as Hyperians don't necessarily agree with everything in Gnosticism. We are not Sethian Gnostics, we're Hyperians, but we can, uncover pearls of wisdom from these texts. I just want to keep that in mind for those who are new. We don't necessarily agree with everything in here, but we are exploring them and finding them interesting and fascinating and can learn from them. But anyway, so the reason why that the Sethian Gnostics sort of have this negative view on death, sex, is because it's further associated with the material world. It's distracting, and you're creating more bodies, and Yaldabaoth wants this for more slaves. But keep in mind, this is certainly not our view. Okay, there's nothing wrong with consensual sex at all. So, but anyway. I just mention it because you're noticing Yaldabaoth is constantly trying to distract people from remembering what they are, and this is just another thing that Yaldabaoth throws at them. In the Secret Gospel of John, it goes even further and talks about money and stuff being even more distractions. Everything associated with the material world they look at as this distraction from Yaldabaoth. We don't necessarily agree with this. I'm just explaining it for sake of completion. Now, the important thing to realize here is, so we have Cain and Abel, and I'm sure that most of you are familiar with the story of Cain and Abel. So we have the sons of Adam and Eve, the sons, just in general, Cain, Abel, and Seth. Cain and Abel were born from Eve and Yaldabaoth, so they are not the true sons of Adam and Eve. It is Seth that is the true son of Adam and Eve. So why is this so important? Well, because remember, in Sethian Gnosticism, Adam and Eve represent the splitting of one being into two. So Seth is the metaphorical representation of the two beings being united as one again in Seth. And so Seth contains the elements of both Adam and Eve united in one being again. So metaphorically, what this represents in Sethian Gnosticism, Seth represents all of humanity. Why does Seth represent all of humanity? Seth represents metaphorically all of humanity, is Cain and Abel and all of humanity ends up dying. Again, I also want to emphasize that Sethian Gnosticism is not consistent across all its books. There are inconsistencies, and that's because Sethian Gnostics weren't interested so much in telling a consistent narrative, in that they were getting across ideas. The Gnostics were very interested in philosophy, and they wanted to wrap their philosophy in these stories. So they weren't so concerned with making sure that all the stories were consistent or, you know, super detailed. They wanted to get across this idea of that we are all part of the true God, the divine God, and we have to wake this up by self-reflection within ourselves and understanding what we truly are. This is how we understand what we truly are. Sethian Gnostics also believed in reincarnation, so you could never escape Yaldabaoth and his archons until you realized your own divinity, and thus you would become more powerful than Yaldabaoth and his archons. So, the reason why Seth is so important is because Seth represents the unity of which was once split. And by the way, if you've ever seen the Dark Crystal has really cool Gnostic themes. You have the two beings, the Skeksis and the I forget what they were called. I forget. I'm sure you remember. You have these two beings. They were split into two, and they were combined again. Anyway, really cool. Really cool themes in the Dark Crystal. But anyway, I am digressing wildly. You have Seth, which represents the unification of what was split. Seth represents all of humanity, because Seth and the children of Seth is what will go on to populate the entire world. So all humanity will be descendants of Seth, meaning all humanity has that unity buried within them. So all humanity has the potential within themselves to recognize their divinity and become more powerful than Yaldabaoth and his archons, the god of the Bible, and transcend the material prison that he has created. So this is why they're called Sethian Gnostics, because we are all, according to Sethian Gnosticism, descendants of Seth, and that metaphorically means each and every one of us has the capacity, by using our epinoia, conceptualization, purposeful thinking, to self-reflect, look within, and attain gnosis, or divine knowledge of what we truly are, remember what we are, and unlock our divinity and transcend the tombs and imprisonment set up by the evil creator god Yaldabaoth. All right, so what we are going to get into next is that Adam has described all this to his son Seth. Now, what Adam is going to do is describe the coming flood, because if you've noticed, there's been this constant battle between humanity and Yaldabaoth. Yaldabaoth is constantly trying to fracture the human and make the human forget. But now through Seth, which again, remember, this is all metaphorical. So Seth is a metaphorical representation of humanity's capacity to know what it is and develop self-reflective thought. So what's going to happen is that we're going to see that through Seth, you're going to have people revolting against Yaldabaoth. And Yaldabaoth is going to, the creator god, is going to try and eliminate them through the flood. So what we're going to look at now is the flood, the great flood, Noah's Ark. And Adam is going to be warning Seth about this upcoming flood and what can be done about it. And we're going to see that according to the apocalypse of Adam, Noah is actually evil, a very evil character that strikes a dark deal with Yaldabaoth, the so-called God of the Bible. However, there is a lot to unpack there, so I'm actually going to save that for next week. So next week, we are going to continue the apocalypse of Adam, because I think there's a lot to digest here, as we now get into the story of, Adam revealing to Seth what the story of the flood and Noah's Ark truly is. And that is what we will be looking at next time. A big shout out to all the supporters on Patreon, especially Kuro Kumo, Timothy, White Rabbit, John, Rex, Naruda, Rupfu, and Roger, as well as all our top supporters on Patreon. Thank you guys so much. If you want to support on Patreon, consider doing so. The link is right here. You get access to our weekly secret live streams, as well as other things like, for example, the lecture notes for tonight's live stream and many others. So consider supporting there. It's how my work can continue to create despite all the censorship on YouTube and Facebook, etc.